Welcome.
The Pathology Innovation Collaborative Community is a regulatory science initiative that aims to facilitate innovations in pathology, as well as advance safety and effectiveness evaluation. The PI Collaborative Community aims to harmonize approaches to speed delivery to patients through collaboration in the pre-competitive space. The PI CC is open to all stakeholders, public or private, including but not limited to academia, industry, healthcare providers, patients, and advocacy groups. Meetings of this kind are an example of lawful activity under federal antitrust law because the focus of the meeting is on government action or policy, including the industry's responses or positions taken with respect thereto. However, antitrust monitoring is needed for companies' own protection since they are direct competitors meeting together. These meetings need to stay within protected subject matters and need to be monitored so that they do not stray off into inappropriate areas, such as pricing and price terms, sales and service territories for particular products, customers and customer territories, each company's individual decisions regarding selection of suppliers or customers, marketing plans and especially future marketing plans or new product offerings, other proprietary or competitively sensitive information. Today's meeting will follow the written agenda and there will be no discussion of pricing or other prohibited topics. If the discussion veers into those topics, we will terminate the discussion. If you have any questions or concerns about the propriety of the discussion, please raise it immediately, and we will take a break to determine how best to proceed. The Medical Device Innovation Consortium acts as the formal convener, and we will follow their conflict of interest policy. For additional information, we defer to our Code of Conduct and our website, www.pathologyinnovationcc.org. We look forward to moving the field forward.
Perfect. Welcome, everyone. Glad to see several familiar faces. Hi, Ulysses. Let's see. Let me see this. There's Scott. Wonderful. A lot of people here. I love it. So, let me just quickly get started. Ulla, can you enable my screen sharing, please? All right, can you see my slides here? So, welcome to the CLIA Waiver, and there's an immediate asterisk here, project, trying to tackle some of the complexities regarding the continued enforcement discretion for remote review during the public health emergency, i.e. COVID-19. I think a lot of you have already indicated that there's numerous topics to be discussed, and I wanted to start with just a few slides, I think 10, to provide sort of the context and the relevance for the field of pathology, etc. So we have 3 meetings scheduled. It's a gigantic topic. I don't know if we can actually cover all of it, but just quickly, you're in this session now and there's 2 more coming. The reason why this is crammed into the end of the year is that, currently there's a lot of discussion going on about whether the public health emergency will continue. And the reason being that, tax day is coming up, and that's kind of like, that sets a clock for either another complete year or not. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. It's just all sort of rumors from the hill. To briefly outline what we're currently doing is there's, let's just say, a need to get a CLIA license for certain remote activities, and that was before we called it past, so pre-pandemic. There was a memorandum, and we go over some of the quick details for everyone to have like a common basis. That's currently still the state, and we're talking about a future state where we either revert back to the prior standard, where we establish the current practice as the new standard, or where we propose a novel practice, whatever that is. So that could be a new standard of remote review and what that would entail from a regulatory perspective. very likely we're talking about sort of a mixture of these two, and what that would look like is currently, of course, predictions are hard to make, especially about the future. Famous quote from Niels Bohr. So what we're trying to accomplish here is basically a few things. So number one, to provide a go-to resource so that pathologists know, hey, if there's questions, that's like basically like a resource to look at. Of course, the primary CLIA documents are, of course, what counts, but sort of a more practical thing. These are the points you can read. I hope that is okay for everyone. I'm not sure whether there were other topics that would need to be discussed. I know there was a long API listserv, almost like a conversation that covered numerous different issues, so we can talk about that in a second. I wanted to set the stage for this discussion by outlining briefly what CMS is thinking about when they issued the memorandum. Can't speak on their behalf, but just to keep certain things in mind and sort of explain the relevance for this from a high-level perspective. So the CMS memorandum currently accounts for the scope of a certain level of, let's just call it oversight in pathology lab medicine. I put here a couple of sections just to say that, of course, this applies also to clinical pathology, etc. And of course, there's subspecialties. I picked out one here, for example, breast, but it applies to cytopathology or remote release of clinical results as well. Now, when it comes to the function of what we're talking about with remote diagnostics, I think we have to distinguish 4 buckets, and they have various names, and I just wanted to throw this out there so we can put these in different components. So one is, of course, you key out a result that you have obtained in a CLIA lab. So you reviewed the case in your lab, and then you just take your cases home and, let's say, remote VPN in, whatever we want to call this, and then key out the results. You can review slides remotely. If you have a microscope at home, you may carry your slides home. That has been the actual basis for CLIA. I get to that in a second. That usually is referred to as home screening. It leaves open whether you also key out the cases, so that would be basically the combination of these two things. Then there's just the general use of digital pathology in your lab, which is just using whole slide imaging in a CLIA laboratory. That's by itself controversial. So that would be the part where you could say that's primary review and primary diagnostics. And there's the issue of using digital pathology remotely. That implies that you have a whole slide imaging process in a CLIA lab and that you perform primary review at an offsite location, and that would be primary remote review. And there's probably numerous nuances of these components here. If so I just wanted to throw this out there before we start discussing this, to keep in mind that very likely under the same memorandum, numerous laboratories have evolved their practices into some mixture of this. So I'm looking forward to learning what people consider the most relevant. I think for many, digital pathology is probably a hot topic, but I would also contest that the purpose of this was to enable, for example, some of the older workforce to be not exposed to, challenging situations. Wanted to provide brief background on the home screening. If you haven't heard, the reason, and this is just sort of a snippet that happened after the actual incident, so there was a big reveal article, I think in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal at the time, about pap mills. So just Google pap mills and read up on it. Ultimately, the whole issue of CLIA was that a quality assurance system had to be obtained, and there were tons of lawsuits afterwards. I just wanted to point out to that's basically revitalizing or, restarting the discussion of whether people can use their own home for laboratory purposes. Now, as a last set of starting points, I wanted to show something fairly basic, and that is the following. This memorandum is not addressing pathologists. It is also addressing laboratory leadership, but it's very important to keep in mind that this memorandum is addressing the state survey agency directors. And there's a very specific reason for that, to keep that in mind. So first of all, in the header, in the footer and in the first sentence that is emphasized. So this memorandum provides laboratory surveyors important guidance, and it is effective immediately, and that was March 26th, so early phase of the US pandemic. And this policy should be communicated with all survey and certification staff, the managers, and the state regional office training coordinators. So keep in mind, we're talking here about a regulatory deviation to establish enforcement discretion via informing surveyors. And I wanted to briefly explain why they did this. So the issue, for example, if we go to a CLIA certificate, there's a specific section in there that defines multiple sites. To have a multi-site eligible CLIA certificate, you have to fulfill these sections, and I defer to the eligibility for multiple lab site codes here. It's far too complicated to go through. Please read this. It all is fairly straightforward. I'm showing this for the following reasons. If a surveyor would encounter a practice where someone performs, let's say, microscopy without a waiver or without a CLIA certificate at multiple sites, you would be dinged for it in an audit. And to get to that point, the surveyors had to override for this, let's say, public health emergency, a certain section in the state operations manual. So if you're the surveyor, meaning the addressant of this memorandum, there's in chapter 6 of the state operations manual, there's a specific section, 6036 for example, and there's 5 others, that says, that for a testing without a CLIA certificate, you do the following things. Again, I defer to these changes here. These were actually changed in January 2020, and then afterwards the memorandum came out to basically define in this specific letter here what has to be in effect to not ding a lab for not having a CLIA certificate under certain provisions. And there are 5. So a laboratory can utilize temporary testing sites for remote review and reporting of slides and images. So that encounters those 4 categories if these 5 points are fulfilled. Now we won't have time to go through these 5, but I just wanted to share like a few things. The basic rule in this particular section refers mainly to things that are fairly common in pathology. You have to have a process, you have to have, a permanent supply and storage, and you have to fulfill the retention requirements, and you have to be Hipaa compliant. We provide this slide which details the specific sections. There's like 14 requirements of a procedure that you have to establish that you would be audited for, and 3 specific deferrals to other sections that I just provide here that define, for example, how specimen submission and handling has to be done, which would be probably at the main site. And then there's the establishment of performance specifications. So this is the accuracy, precision, and all the good stuff about, what I think has been published several times, how to do this, for example, for digital pathology, and then the standard retention requirements. So this is basically the section that would still be audited under this current state of the issued memorandum, where you have to fulfill these 5 rules to be able to not be dinged under the testing without a CLIA certificate. So this sort of like section of the introduction just states that everyone is on the same page. What is this memorandum actually doing? It eliminates the ability, or it restricts the ability to ding testing without a CLIA certificate if the following 5 things are applied. And that's sort of like, to go back to this original slide here, that is kind of the current state that we're in. I think there have not been a lot of CMS audits, and I don't know, I just wanted to provide this as sort of a quick overview of as a starting point for this discussion. So I can leave the slides up sort of in an overview perspective here if that's helpful. And now I shut up and open it up for like a brief discussion of what we're trying to accomplish here. So don't know, I throw it out to the group. whether this is helpful or whether there are questions about this background and what people are thinking.
That was extremely helpful. I wonder if it might be useful to just bring a little bit of institutional memory, as in the institution of pathology, to this discussion as a preface. You're very appropriate to bring up the Pap Mill story, which is, of course, what triggered all this. The problem, or at least I think the lesion in the regulatory framework that I see, can be best showcased by looking at one of our peer specialties, radiology, that doesn't have the same similar set of onerous requirements. And the current regulatory framework in radiology is really based on common sense that the equipment needs to be type certified. And of course, that's done by regulatory agencies. But the practice of radiology itself is left as a professional activity. And I think the core problem here is that when CLIA was cast as a regulatory framework, it either intentionally or unintentionally co-involved the practice of pathology by pathologists as being part of the regulatory setting. That is to say, it is now prescriptive or what a pathologist can or cannot do, exercising their judgment to render diagnoses or render observations in various settings. Radiologists can practice home radiology. They're still required, of course, to have all the compliance with the equipment being type certified, confidentiality of information and the like. But there's no regulatory framework that requires for example, if they're in their house signing out a case remotely or in a different location, to have that location signed out. And I think our discussion, at least in part, should focus on carving out the practice of pathology, which is already subject to credentialing by the boards and by state licensure, from the operation, the pre-analytical steps that a laboratory has to make a quality slide. And of course, you could say, well, there needs to be a quality image. Well, yes, you regulate and you validate your image pipeline, but at the end of the day, the real metric of quality is the pathologist's medical judgment and whether that image is suitable for diagnosis. And I would offer that CLIA has no part in usurping the ability of a pathologist who is a physician to operate independently, exerting their own judgment. So this is a fundamental change, I think, where we need to carve out the fact that pathology as a medical profession needs to be able to operate independently of a regulatory framework that's concerned with things like the physical location of where the pathology is located. That is, I think, completely antiquated in the setting of remote presence technology and digital image exchange. Like, for example, as you already pointed out, the nuances of sign out location really are compounded. What if you're remotely located? I mentioned this in the listserv, but logged into your desktop at work, which is a certified desktop. Well, you're kind of offsite and onsite at the same time. Does that constitute violating the CLIA location address? I don't know. I think the answer is obscure because the regulatory framework never anticipated this hybrid setting. But I think more fundamentally than that, we really need to carve out the fact that we are professionals, we are physicians, and should not be subject to a regulatory framework telling us how we can or cannot exercise our medical judgment. And I think this is the overreach that happened many, many years ago with CLIA and the CLIA committee that needs to be corrected. So maybe I'm taking a hardline approach in wanting to really correct CLIA, but I see this as the core lesion, that the professional regulatory freedom of pathologists has been unnecessarily impinged. And we only need to look to radiology example of a more fundamental way of doing this, which allows regulatory oversight of the pre-analytic quality that goes into a slide or any other type of lab image or document, but at the same time it allows the practice of pathology to be unencumbered by artificial constraints. I've already said too much, but I think that's the core lesion, not just physical location, but just the overreach into practice itself.
Thank you. That's what do other people think about this? I think that's a very a very good way of putting it.
I think that ends up being the key. I mean, Joe, first of all, thanks for that. Actually, I kind of needed it because I don't I'm not good at reading documents. And so you've sort of diced it. I hope the presentation is available and you'll appreciate the opinion too. I might take a little bit more milder opinion, but I think the overall gauge is what's the right consistency or temperature? Where is the right amount without being too prescriptive, too restrictive to allow us to practice? Two questions I had in mind. This is from Joe, your presentation, like the state surveyors. I didn't catch that. So that was interesting when you say state surveyors. Who are those? I think in New York State, obviously it's going to be New York State, but I think for most places it's going to be CAP. Is that correct? So in some ways they're speaking to the state agencies that do a lot, like New York State, and then the other is the other proxies that are CAP. Am I wrong about that? That's going to be my first question.
So there is a list of state surveyors, and that can be handed to third parties. CAP is one of those accredited parties. New York State, is another one. I think I have a list, so it depends on state and jurisdiction. But yeah, so it's those individuals, the state and regional office coordinators, typically affiliated or associated with the Department of Health with the respective state, are usually providing that. I find the list and I can paste in the chat. Andrew, you raised your hand.
Yep. Hi.
Good seeing you.
Good to see you. Yoel, I agree completely with everything you said. The CLIA legislation and the way it was created never envisioned being able to work the way we can work now. And I think just to extend it in terms of the points you raised about image quality and another very important consideration is privacy and Hipaa compliance. I mean, we know that the College of American Pathologists through the lab accreditation program will be increasing the checklist requirements as the use of digital pathology becomes more widespread. And I think that this is a logical place where the CAP can play a role in terms of setting standards for image quality, histology, for labs that are using digital pathology for diagnostic purposes, and also the Hipaa piece as well. That's so I think that can be covered off. That doesn't have to reside with under any kind of a CLIA umbrella.
And so you're saying that basically that the assurance of the image quality or the integrity of the test should reside with the primary lab, or sorry
yeah, that's what Yoel was saying. Basically, it's it shouldn't be in any pathologist's interest to accept substandard blurry images and try to make diagnoses from them just for the I know that the concern has always been, returning back to the garage-based pap smear operations that spurned the CLIA legislation in the first place. But I don't think it's in any pathologist's interest in this day and age to accept really terrible images and make diagnoses just to turn a buck, because that's going to come back and bite you. Any sort of medical legal proceeding will look at that slide and say, "Excuse me, doctor, what were you thinking here?" Nobody can interpret that slide. So I think that's the emphasis. Right to Yoel's point, it's in the professional judgment of the pathologist as to whether it's suitable, and that's the role of validation, verification, all these types of things that have to go in place for digital pathology, regardless of where you're practicing it.
And to be clear, this is exactly the model that is serving radiology right now very well. It works. It's been proven to work. It's in use. There's nothing novel here.
I think I'd like to sort of drill a little bit more.
Saying that just because mammography is a separate entity, and MQSA does certification and states do certification for the mammography. So I would say yes, it's standard practice for all of radiology except mammography.
Yeah, I'd like to drill a bit more to clarify maybe in my mind about, because we threw out some words in terms of validation, there's credentialing, and then there's accreditation. And maybe I've got a very non-nuanced view of this, but I think of accreditation as the all-encompassing umbrella, which might even tie into competency. And so when you talk about accreditation and whichever these surveyors, they come and they audit you, that's all part of it. And so if competency is built in, this is where obviously CMS doesn't really reside in this area, but the people that accredit you do. And so there are ways to actually guide how you get accredited so that we can actually control the environment. Because I think that's the conversation we're having. How do we control it? So it's not a free wild west on things. We still have quality controls that are there, and yet it gives us freedom to be able to practice. I think this is the right consistency that we're looking for. And it's going to be the job of the people or the folks that do the accreditation, in my mind. And if we get these terms right, I think this is where we can sort of attack the problem and go about this.
I agree, Joe. I think, and it does ultimately, I think it does come down to validation. So any type of a lab inspection that's carried out, the inspectors will see slide scanners, and how do you use the scanners? That's how these things go. Well, we use them for consultation, for primary diagnosis, frozen section. And then the next question can be, do you use this for offsite primary reporting? And if the answer is yes, then can you produce documents that showed that you validated the home workstations? So much the way you did in that the very nice modern pathology paper that described how you guys validated primary sign out at MSK. So those can be a very logical set of questions, and I think it would be fairly simple to set up a list of or checklist items that inspectors could use.
So let me ask back on this. So what you were saying is you should get out of our way, right? Like try to get rid of this, let's say, regulatory overreach. But what both you, Andrew, and Joe just said is that this part during an inspection, if you can produce the documents, which I think everyone agrees that could be produced, then the current state would actually be what we're asking for. Because that is currently what, I mean, these requirements here apply, right? Control procedures, you have to, I mean, this is tiny, but here is basically how do you establish, that's the CMS terminology for the word validation, like how do you establish and verify performance specifications? So this is what you just said. So are we aligned on that, or?
Oh, I think what we were trying to get at, and I'll let you, I see your hand, I apologize, I jumped ahead, but what we're trying to do right now is to see how many degrees of freedom do we have under this constraint. We're working with the current rules, and what we're trying to do right now is work with those rules. Maybe it requires clarification and further definition in this modern age. Everything was defined under physicality, which is not relevant today. Can we define it, sort of interpret these in the context of today within the current rules? So that I think that's what we're trying to do now. Now, if things don't apply, that's when we look at more amendments and revisions and things like that. I think but if we have things that can fit, maybe you can clarify it further. Physicality, maybe it should be environment versus some physical, locality. There are certain words we can change that actually encompass the spirit, but it meets today's context.
You're muted.
Gone silent.
Mute.
Sorry about that. So I agree completely with that. There was a comment earlier about throwing out that I'm not suggesting at all we throw out a regulatory framework. We need standards. The images need to be of a minimum quality or better. I mean, we all want that. What the issue here, though, is professionalism versus laboratory operations. The pre-analytical step, everything that goes from acquiring the tissue of the block to generating the unstained slide, to staining the slide, the scanning the slide, all that is extremely important. The quality of the image should be regulated, should be validated, and that's part of the lab credentialing. But when you say a pathologist needs to be in location X versus location Y to practice, that is what is overly prescriptive. A pathologist is expected under the guise of precision, of professionalism, to say, okay, wherever I'm signing out, there has to be confidentiality.
Let me just specify this, but that currently is exempt, right? Because what you're saying is fulfill the basic rules of the lab, fulfill the processes to generate images under appropriate validations, and then, you have to keep the retention requirements I'm sure you're agreeing with. It should be Hipaa compliant. So the current state is effectively what you're asking for, right?
Well, without the exemptions, though, every location, let's say you're at your house signing out a case on your on-call on weekend, that location needs to be registered with Hipaa, with CLIA as a CLIA location.
But now you're talking about the past, right?
Well, no, but that we're talking about the potential of going back to the past. And that's what I'm saying needs to be permanently relaxed, because, for example, radiologists right now don't have to worry about that. They have to
get it.
the environment of professionalism wherever they sign out a case, whether it be a hotel room when they're in a national meeting or in their home. There's still the expectation of privacy, of Hipaa, of confidentiality. That never goes away. But to say basically that you have the added burden in the course of you practicing medicine to register yourself, we're already state licensed. So I would say, yeah, if you're doing that from another state, maybe there needs to be specific laws, because you're practicing actually.
Totally. Okay. I think to summarize, you're arguing to not use this way to the prior standard. So the future standard should not be the past, correct?
That is correct.
So now my question is,
Although,
are you saying, give me 1 second.
Mike, I would just say that
Yeah.
you're referring only to digital sign out, not analog, right?
You mean like slides being shuttled around?
Yeah, like actual analog slides.
This use
the
case.
current state or the previous state makes sense for analog assets and analog asset preparation.
Yeah, because when you lose physical control of the assets, that creates a problem. You're right. We're talking about digital sign out for digital media.
Okay, so that's why I wanted to really make sure that I understand what you're saying, Yul, because so far you basically condemned this part for digital pathology, but the proposed novel practice, you're just saying don't regulate our professional activity, which is basically what has been done with the memorandum for digital pathology.
To some extent. I mean, if we go through the fine point, though, it's still more regulated than the reality for radiology. So this is where I think a large group like what you've put together, and I applaud this effort, needs to go through this with a fine-tooth comb to look for edge conditions where it may be, and I'm not sure it is, but may be still overly prescriptive. This is our one opportunity to clean this up. And I think as a specialty, and that means ASCP and CAP, API, all these groups and DPA need to work together and really go through it with a fine-tooth comb and make sure there's no prescriptive leftovers.
Okay, so but what Michael just mentioned is very important, because when we talk about the physical assets traveling around, you would agree that that may be a different element than just, in parentheses, reviewing things on screen.
Absolutely, because then there's protecting, because there's a standard of care for protecting assets, and we need to be clear. We're talking about digital media and remote presence.
Yeah, let me clarify one thing too. Right now, we're a very digital pathology savvy group, and we're probably speaking in that context. But as Alexis has pointed out in the API listserv, there are other context use cases: molecular sign out remotely, CP sign out remotely.
But it's all digital. That can all
digital, but there's the analog, and I think, Joe, you put it on your slide. We might have to define it for them. Like, okay, this is what it looks like. Right now, we're defining it mainly in the digital path space because that's the group we have currently here. But every group, AMP, might have to sort of define what does it look like for them under some type of controlled environment, because we can't leave it to just, obviously CMS can't do it, but the regulators don't. We probably are best defining it ourselves. This is the way it looks like. This is how we're going to be able to control it.
Absolutely. So that's why I put this slide up, to make sure that we're not only thinking about, of course, we're all digital path aficionados, but if we, as let's call it the representatives of 6, 7, 8, whatever, how many professional societies, one element here is, I think it was very smart, I mean, these are the folks that do it, right, to address the surveyors. So changing a state operations manual is something fundamentally different than changing CLIA. Right, that's like opening a can of worms where you cannot possibly reach anything in less than a decade. So in other words, one element to really get to the level of detail that you and Joe and Michael and Andrew have outlined would be to provide the provisions for surveyors to make sure if a site is doing remote work. And that is a guidance that is much easier changed. As you see, this is revision 199, so these things get revised much quicker. And I think that would play alongside what the group here, under Dr. Wright and the branch managers have already done and provided as kind of an outline.
I think you hit it. That's right. That's why I brought up the accreditation agencies. They can interpret things in certain ways. The interpretation is where you have flexibility. CLIA is much harder. It's upstream. But there, as Yul pointed out, there might be a couple word here, a phrase here that could be tweaked. I wouldn't say necessarily changed, but tweaked to actually accommodate the regulatory framework or the accreditation framework to do further flexibility in interpretation. So the physicality, that we might think of a different word or different phrase to allow the accreditors more flexibility to accommodate the use case, whether it's molecular sign out, digital sign out, analog, they can define it that way. So I don't think CLIA needs to be changed much, but there might be some tweaking for the modern age to allow for flexibility downstream. That was kind of my hope on things.
And a very important point was raised. There are multiple practice models, like for example, in clinical lab medicine, there's remote microbiology, which could be dynamic telemicroscopy. It's digital, but it's, in other words, you're starting at the physical slide. That slide is in the lab, but the microbiologist might be at their home or somewhere else. That should be in scope for the language we recommend, because so CP could be just as much in scope as AP for getting that exemption in place, because the practice of microscopy in CP is also a professional pursuit that is based on credentialing. It shouldn't be based on CLIA, because those individuals are also credentialed.
So in other words, of course, this is focused on digital pathology and slides, but in a way, a remote review or result release under clinical pathology would fall into different buckets as well, right? I mean, if someone takes the microbiology plates home, that's probably not good practice, right? So I think certain things, or COVID, right? But I'm just saying, so this is, I didn't put a funnel here, but this is very interconnected. So if hepatobiliary AP subspecialty has a certain practice of taking home special stains, that may require, specification. So I think that may be a good thing for the various societies to come up with these buckets that then we have to put together as, is it a physical asset or not? So this is almost like a rubric that can be applied.
I mean, like in special chemistry, like an SPEP. You can't take the gel home, but you can certainly look at it from your home, and that should be allowed.
Yeah. And that's why I want to thank you, Joe, for putting it up there, because in some ways you provide a figure for us to target for. You provide different guidances. So yes, and if this is molecular, if this is laboratory, this is how you do. By thinking of it in terms of bins, where you can provide nuance and definition, that can be left to us. That doesn't have to be a CMS CLIA thing. That can be left to whoever is actually surveying in terms of their interpretation. But it's further definition and clarification for all of us trying to figure this out.
So let me there's I see certain chat questions. I want to make sure that those are also addressed by the group. So Jeff, do you want to maybe that we spend a second here on this? Would be
sure. Just a little bit of a side question, but right, I think right for medical legal, if I'm signing out on a crummy image, I'd rather not preserve that, but maybe I would rather preserve that someone can't come in later and say well, maybe you didn't do a good job because the image was blurry. So, maybe, in addition to validation, we need some kind of real-time metric of image quality that's when the slide was signed out, the image quality was X DPI, such and such some kind of metadata that says, yeah, right at the time that this was done, the quality was adequate.
No, that's a great point. That we should certainly, under professionalism, document that. But we already have a major gap in our on-site practice. For example, if somebody signs out a frozen section diagnosis and misses the case, and they say, well, I saw it, but I didn't feel that was a diagnostic lesion. We don't currently, with glass slides, have a way of documenting what fields were reviewed by the pathologist of record on the frozen and at what magnification they were viewed. And in point of fact, if you go digital, you have the opportunity to record both. What field was reviewed, what magnification was it looked at, and for how long did the pathologist dwell? I'm not saying we should keep that, but we have the opportunity to do so. So if anything, the digital modality provides a better documentation of what we do, which protects us potentially, because we can show, yes, we looked at it, and at the time we felt it wasn't pathognomonic of some diagnosis, and the record will show I even showed it to a colleague. So we shouldn't be in fear of this. We should embrace the fact we have the ability now to create far more detailed fiduciary transcripts of what we do diagnostically. You can do that whether you're doing digital pathology on site or remotely. Our image management systems can and do in fact document that if we turn it on in real time. So you raise a great point, Jeff, and again, that should be separated though from the professionalism. I think that's a software feature that can be required, but that's independent of where the pathologist is practicing medicine.
And I think that should be pointed out here. Amram, I saw you posted something here as well.
Oh, we can't hear you, Amram. Maybe your microphone's out.
Cannot hear you, sorry. That's like a new thing. You're unmuted and we can't hear you. That's like a double whammy during the pandemic.
That's high tech.
How about now? How about now?
Yes,
We can hear you.
I got too many microphones going on. Sorry, I unmuted the wrong one. Yeah, I think that the discussion, can go in a million different directions at this point. The clinical pathology angle is one I'm very, very interested in. I think another one is this kind of reflecting on Dr. Belise's point about the professional aspect of this. I think it's also fair to point out that, if a pathologist can sign out a television image at home, would we necessarily restrict the medical technologist from doing the same? And that could be a cell. I mean, I'm using hematology. It could be microbiology. And what about discrete lab results, right? For a verifiable test, a discrete result. Typically, sometimes we would have even auto verification rules. Didn't hit auto verification rules, and a medical technologist at home verify the result, assuming that they can do the appropriate procedures and checks from home.
I think those are tough questions. Andrew, I see your hand. Let me just quickly check. There's Richard Torres. I want to make sure that people get that. So Richard and then Andrew. Richard, hi.
Hi, how are you? I just wanted to see if it might make sense, to know exactly what path we should take, potential paths to take, and whether a lawyer or potentially a lobbyist could help. Just make sure that we don't go down a path that may not make sense.
So maybe briefly, one of the things that I can tell you at least that we get a lot of traction from people just looking at the content that we put out with Pathology Innovation Collaborative Community that's kind of like across societies, and of course it's always built by the people on the call. So I can tell you the FDA and CMS reviews these things, so it's just one way of communicating this. When it comes to lobbying, we have to abstain from that. That's just sort of a rule under the FDA Collaborative Community Guidance. But the information or suggestions, what subject matter experts across societies feel or consider important, that's one way of portraying that. Now we have some patient advocacy and MDIC as those are participants here. Whatever we create here, I think we should run by some of the patient advocacy groups. We have very good relations also with the American College of Radiology. We could ask them for let's say their position on what you for example propose. So I'm not sure whether whether CMS expects a full-on legal advice appropriate or compliant result, right? I mean, Joe and I have drafted a letter at the early phase of the pandemic just to say what we thought, and I think one point which is this sort of star here, everyone thought that this is a waiver. CMS can't issue an 1135 waiver. That's just a different legal issue. So I think they know that we're not held to like a legal standard, etc. Andrew.
Yep. Well, just a quick point. I mean, most of the discussion around these things typically revolves around the risks of doing something and the negative consequences of doing something digitally, particularly from a remote location. But I think it's also important to consider the opposite, the risks of not doing it. So in other words, if the most appropriate pathologist to review a particular case or provide an opinion, particularly in, say, in a time-sensitive situation, would be taken out of the diagnostic loop simply because they're in a remote location, you could argue that is a very strong value proposition for allowing this to proceed in a prudent way.
It's a very, very good way of pitching this, because they are remote. Michael, you put something in the chat?
Yeah, people are questioning whether, what roles should have the ability to communicate digitally with information that may have been developed within the laboratory. I think somebody was asking about cytotechs or medical technologists being able to provide similar functionality as a pathologist. And I don't think it's role-based. I think it's asset-based. So if you're dealing with the interpretation of assets that are analog and the analog asset creation must be in a CLIA facility. I don't think any one of us would argue that. But the evaluation of that material, as long as there's best practices. Hang on a sec, I got to take this call.
I think we hear you. We understand that. We need to define that also for analog in a remote, if you're a remote evaluation setting. How does that look? I know institutions do that currently, but they're using this relaxation waiver. But I think we could formalize it, actually, for those that are doing the surveying. I think that's probably his point, Mike's point. I had my hand raised because I wanted to stir the pot even more, but I didn't know. This is a great conversation. I hate to pivot, but this might be pivoting. Did anybody have anything else before I might?
There were two quick things, so I will definitely get back. So Jim Midori, just want to make sure that we account for the various people on here. Jim, you still there?
I am. Sorry, I had to mute myself. No, so I was just, again, thinking, everybody else was thinking about making sure that we've got any potential digital asset looked at so that we can say this can be done and done remotely. I'm concerned about how deep we segregate things. Should we, go broad, like Dr. Belize said, look at radiology. How can we mirror what radiology is doing, as opposed to going deeply dividing everything in pathology as well?
I mean, that is a good point. I think maybe I'll try to address that one in terms of, CLIA is here to stay, and it's really hard to rewrite the thing, and it's not going to go away, and that's just history. So we're basically burned by that. Radiology doesn't have that, so they have the freedom. I think going broad would be great if we didn't have CLIA, but we now have it, and so we're working among constraints and rules. And this is probably the easiest way, short of really, really taking a hard hammer to CLIA itself. That's a hard ask, politically and across the board on many different fronts. And so when you want to go broad, that's the avenue. It's the rabbit hole that you have to go down to, completely different from what we're talking about now.
I know. I just wonder, though, as someone pointed out earlier, this is an opportune time to review CLIA. And should we take this opportunity to go broad right now, where we've got a great opportunity and a great use case? I agree, it's a huge task, but will there ever be a good opportunity as this to do it?
If that were to occur, I think it requires some really good legal words, people that are very good about wording and looking at ramifications. And I have to admit, I'm not sure if Joe, it's going to require some very, very big thought on that. And,
Can you still hear me? Sorry, my computer froze, but I can still hear you, but no movement happening here.
We can hear you.
Awesome. I mean, a quick point out to this opportunity. So I'm sure you heard about the Valid versus Vital Act. Vital is basically proposing to revise CLIA. That's the Vital Act in a nutshell. The problem is someone actually has to.
Oh, you just cut out, Joe.
He probably can't hear us either if his Zoom
Oh,
crashed.
yeah.
Let's just wait a minute, see if he comes back.
Yeah, that's another. I mean, I'm glad he brought it up while we're waiting for him to come in. But the vital and valid, that might just disrupt everything, and that is an opportunity while this big disruption happens. It's still in the works. I don't think it's gotten a lot of traction yet, but that's one to keep in mind for those in the group about the Vital and Valid Act. There's big distinctions, and it's important to know. Joe can speak better to it than. In fact, I learned most of the stuff from him on this one. But one of them, I can't remember. Basically wants to put everything under an FDA. So LDTs would be going away versus the other one where there's flexibility about LDTs. That's a very, very big thing.
And that would be a disaster for innovation in the clinical lab if we lost LDTs.
If you lost LDTs. And this is actually a big debate among organizations. So as a pathology field, we're not unified in terms of our organizational viewpoint on this. And there's probably people on the call that have different takes on this thing as well. But yes, if one of these goes in there, it's very big disruption. It does provide an opportunity, but it also might go in the wrong way for CLIA.
Yeah. One observation, though, just by witnessed all the people on this call, because Joe mentioned the concern about need of expertise, the amount of intellectual horsepower, because I suspect there are more people than just on the call. Just looking at the panel of people on this call, we have an amazing panel of intellectual horsepower we can direct at this. And I think that the FDA and CLIA, the CLIA committee would be positively impressed, not just by the participation, but by the output a group such as this could generate. So we shouldn't discount ourselves. I mean, we've got people that are like define digital pathology, like Andrew on the call, for example, and yourself, Joe. So we've got some traction here, potentially, if we use it the right way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, whether it's valid or vital, it won't change that we have to actually provide the domain expertise in concrete terms. And if it's too specific for some, I think the legal experts at CMS can bring it onto a more general level. But I think what we outlined today, I mean, for example, that we should account for physical versus digital assets, and that can be easily addressed. But the consequences we have to discuss in sessions like this. So I wholeheartedly agree with what you just said.
And as part of my pivot, you're talking about definitions. There's definitely definitions. One of them was on the listserv. I think either Eric or somebody. I got this from somebody. The definition of infrequent remote sign out. We don't know the number. Well, we could provide that number because everybody's been assuming 10% or something like that. And these are examples of things that we can further clarify, and they're not hard to actually do that, in terms of if you really are hard pressed and you can't do it in a nice, normal home office, what's the appropriate number? These are certain things that doesn't leave it wide open. And there are probably other examples in the waiver that's currently as stated.
So
go ahead.
Can I just throw out one thing for the next session as an idea? So I know that these, let's call it regulatory deviations, have opened up the spectrum of changes and practices. And I would really like to provide, I mean, this is not easily done quantitatively, but have some people actually provide what has been done. I mean, MSK, your papers, Joe and Matthew Hanna, those papers are known and they give a very clear outline to other institutions how to do it. But what has been done, especially in some of the other healthcare institutions, and I would find it very instructive to really go a little bit deeper. Like, do you take your heart biopsies home? Or is someone scanning those just to review, not that they have a whole site imaging workflow established for primary diagnosis, but for some experts that are remotely and don't want to come in or didn't, want to expose themselves to risk. What do people think about sort of collecting some of the practices and comparing that? Because I haven't seen that anywhere.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. We have 2 more sessions, and that would be great. When I plan to be on all of them, and I can bring in Matt and see which one is available. We can bring what we've basically done. Not to say that that's the template that we should do, but it provides an example. It's something that got us past New York State, you know, and there's probably certain things that other people do that we could learn from, but it seems to work for us.
That would certainly be educational, right? To see what you have to do to get there.
Yeah, yeah. I was the pivot, and I think we can also say that also for follow-up is also moving forward, because I think we made a lot of progress about discussing things. I was gonna work from the other way, maybe moving forward. Let's pretend if we are that surveyor, what are the types of things, because I'm gonna get to the elephant in the room on this one, because I am concerned about this one too. I really hate, I mean, I've been watching Uber. I see what it does to people, and I call it the Uberization of pathology. I want to know how to overcome that so that not the jobs can be easily outsourced. And, you know, ensuring quality, you know, actually ties in very well for this. So what would that look like if you're a surveyor? You know, would it involve maybe spot checks, surprise inspections of home offices, either virtually or such, coming back to physical location once in a while requirement just to QA your stuff to make sure that your digital and your physical actually match your diagnoses? What would that look like? That's the conversation that we can actually do. What would trying to control the environment remotely, keeping the hub and spoke very well controlled, what does that look like from a surveyor perspective? I think that's actually, there's a lot of opportunity to sort of keep Uberization actually from happening, you know, for ours.
You kind of provided the comparison to radiology. What do you think of Joe's point about the Uberification or Uberization?
Well, I think it ties into the central thesis of professionalism. You know, there is certainly the potential risk of the gig economy where people dumb down what is considered professional, but I think we can all agree there are absolute metrics of expectation of performance, like the confidentiality, that the equipment you're using, regardless of where you are, for example, is type certified. So you're not going to be signing out a case on a smartphone, although you could, because it's not certified. Maybe some will be, but right now they're not. So, you know, there is the expectation that you're going to do the right thing. But to have CLIA coming in and saying, well, you're not at your lab, you can't sign out this digital media, when in point of fact, the media, as long as you're on a certified device, would be the same if you're on a certified device in your office versus offsite. And about like the occasional use, how do you occasionally certify a hotel room that you're never going to use again? I mean, we need to have some clarity in how we carve this out so we don't constrict our freedom to operate. So about the Uberification, what I would say is what we recommend should be such that it stands independence of the gig economy, that it just operates on absolute principles of professionalism, recognizing that we're already credentialed by our healthcare enterprises, we're already licensed by our individual states. Shouldn't that be enough to indicate that, you know, we're expected to perform professionally as pathologists? And that's never changed. Why then add an artificial layer that's unnecessary when we're already bound by a higher authority, which is our license?
I mean, from a regulatory science perspective, we have to provide that data to fight back the patient advocacies and some of the health policy that clearly demand more regulation, right? The Valid Act is one way. The FDA may step in for some of the high complexity, high risk LDTs. And, you know, the microscope has not been traditionally you know, under that umbrella.
No, but now you're starting to bring the pathologist's brain into the regulatory framework. That's the problem I've had with this whole process by which we've tried to validate instrumentation. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with a non-inferiority study, but when you start putting in pathologist error rates as inextricably tied to the success of a scanning platform of being acceptable or not, as opposed to using optical physics metrics, you get up in a situation where now pathologists are being treated no differently than medical instrumentation. I think that's a slippery slope.
Yul, I just speak those facts that are hitting the field from outside. It's not my opinion that that should be done.
No, I agree, but I think that those opinions are concerning, And we need to push back against them in a respectful fashion that, you know, regulating a pathologist's brain is not the solution.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I can see why, because this kind of ties into my idea initially of accreditation and building in competency. What's the depth of competency assessment you want to go? Do you want to regulate somebody's brain to that extent, as you're pointing out? I think the obvious answer among all of us is no. But I do think there is a competency for remote sign-out. You just can't bring in the oldest pathologist who doesn't own a smartphone.
No, that's different. That's validation for medical procedures. Yeah. So in a hospital, you get credentialed, but again, that should still be at the credentialing level. You're credentialed to do endoscopy. You're credentialed to use laser surgery as a surgeon. A pathologist would be credentialed.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I don't think that's what our boards and our state boards don't do that. And so right now there is a void for remote. It's different.
No, not the state board, at the hospital level. You are credentialed at the hospital level for medical procedures. We should have periodic assessments as part of our policies and procedures that every year the pathology department goes through an in-service and says, yes, you, Joe or Jill, pathologist, know how to use our image management system and sign out cases remotely. I'm all for that.
Yeah.
What I'm not for, though, is saying that, you as a pathologist are unable to make a diagnosis simply because you're in a different physical location. That's crazy.
Yeah, but I think we need data to support that opinion.
Then let's generate the data. I'm sure we can.
So, yes. I mean, Andrew, you have generated that data, right?
Yeah, we should be absolutely evidence-based, but I'm sure if we try collating the data, the error rates for a certified system and the hardware platform at the office versus off-site, I'm sure we're going to be able to show in a non-inferiority study that it's within the statistical noise of equivalence.
Yeah.
And Andrew, you've done some of that already, right? What's your experience?
Yep, we're in the process of doing it. So we did roll out hospital issue home workstations so that every pathologist basically has the same workstation at home, with one important difference: the monitor. So we opted not to go for the multi-$1,000 barcode displays for home monitors. So we chose an off-the-shelf HP monitor that's $500 a pop, and validated the performance of those in the homework environment versus the barcode monitor in the office, plus the glass slide. And we didn't encounter, close to 300 cases, didn't encounter any issues, and then developed some best practices internally for home sign out, and importantly, deferring to glass slide review.
Ours is the same. We did the same thing.
Exactly what Joe did. And I always thought what the study that MSK did was so compelling, because, and Joe can speak to this, is the lack of impact of displays.
Yeah, the displays are a big thing. I mean, obviously nobody's dumb enough to sign out on iWatch, but I mean, some of the 13-inch displays was kind of amazing to me. Like, wow, people didn't mind. I will caveat certain things. I mean, we are, the group, and this is going back to AI and bias. The group that we have, we're pretty technically savvy as a department. We have a lot of young folks and people that are engaged for it. We didn't bring on the Luddites on there. So that's why I said I'm always a little bit careful. We showed equivalency. When you get the right group, it works. And I think periodic assessment, you'll as reported on, that documentation can be clearly put in without being onerous. We show that from our group, we're very good at that. Rolling out to the community for everybody, I think that there should be some guidelines on, because it's still new. Not everybody has bought onto this. And I think, if I force some of the people that didn't want to do it, because there was a small group that didn't want to do it, I could see a higher failure rate kind of happening. And so, I am publishing a successful thing there, but it's because we had an engagement, we had the right course. So I'm changing the inputs that go into this to show why it's successful, and ensuring that if you broaden it, we have to test it more. That's basically what I'm saying.
All right, I want to be mindful of the time. I think we continue this at the next date. Thank you so much. We provide all the info on the website and send out a reminder. And it would be great if many of you can join for the next session to discuss some of the existing practices, so we can get into those different buckets and provide some details. Thank you very much. This was great.
Thanks, everybody. It's great.